Dark Magician plus Red Eyes Black Dragon, or one dragon effect monster, cannot be destroyed by card effects. Neither player can target this card with card effects. During your main phase, you can destroy one monster your opponent controls, and if you do, inflict damage to your opponent equal to that monster's original attack. You can use this effect a number of times per turn, up to the number of normal monsters used as fusion material for this card. Once per turn, when a card or effect is activated, by the way this is a quick effect, you can discard one card, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card, and if you do that, this card gains 1000 attack points. Malefic Blue Eyes White Dragon cannot be normal summon / set, must first be special summoned from your hand by banishing one Blue Eyes White Dragon from your deck. There can only be one Malefic monster on the field at a time. Other monsters you control cannot declare an attack. If there is no face-up field spell card on the field, destroy this card. Eater of Millions cannot be normal summon / set, must be special summoned from your hand by banishing 5 more cards from your hand, field, and or extra deck. Face down, gains 100 attack / defense points for each face down banished card. Cannot be tributed nor used as material for a fusion, synchro, or XC summon. Once per turn at the start of the damage step, if this card battles an opponent's monster, you can banish that opponent's monster face down. Number 41, Baguska, the Terribly Tired Tapir. This card can be used to ritual summon any Chaos or Black Cluster Soldier ritual monster. You must also tribute monsters from your hand or field and or banish a Blue Eyes White Dragon or Dark Magician from your graveyard, whose total level is exactly equal to the level of the Chaos or Black Cluster Soldier ritual monster you ritual summon. Okay, first impressions are that either I'm having a stroke or these cards are written in ancient Egyptian. Like seriously, some of these cards are so difficult to understand that I need some kind of scientist to decipher these hieroglyphs. You can oftentimes spend 3 minutes or more just staring at a card before finally saying screw it and just playing it blindly, wondering to yourself, is this description still in Japanese? The wording makes it so difficult to comprehend the exact effects of a lot of these cards and when these effects come into play. In fact, sometimes they don't even give a full description of the card effects on the card because they figured it would be too much text. Like, good luck. Now, admittedly, for these examples, I focused on some of the more modern cards, but I didn't have to cherry pick. In this current year of Yu-Gi-Oh history, we are now well past the era where most cards would have flavor text, just for fun, because there was no effects that needed explaining, just monster card art. This legendary dragon is a powerful engine of destruction, virtually indestructible. Very few have faced this awesome creature and lived to tell the tale.
No, you've stripped him of his pride.
Competitive Yu-Gi-Oh is like this iceberg that has been hugging the coast close enough that those land-loving sheep herders could see the party going on top. But that berg is now drifting away into the esoteric fog, becoming less and less accessible to those not already initiated, and also those who just fell off at some point. I mean, this game began in like 1999, and brace yourself, it is now the year 2020X. And the Yu-Gi-Oh anime has seen 5 spin-offs that pushed anime hair to the point that makes me physically sick, and the franchise has suggested bathing to its fanbase. But every true warrior knows that being covered in the dust of the battlefield is what keeps them in a state of constant readiness. It's actually an official tournament rule where judges can, at their own discretion, declare a player to be too funky, get washed, or go home. Like, don't get so caught up in the game that you become a toxic player by default. My point is, trying to get started in Yu-Gi-Oh today is an absolute sick 50-50 grind down a long section of railing, but without the skateboard. Like, you don't even know where to start when it comes to learning how to play this game, not with these cards that are a wall of text as a barrier for entry. And each of these walls is like a vague terms of service agreement, where just as soon as you think you understand how it's supposed to work, it turns out it plays out in a completely different manner. Even if you were to be given a working deck by a more experienced player, it will take quite some time to figure out how that even works. And you're gonna feel like the big dum-dum who has to reinvent the wheel, because the wheel that is just refuses to reveal its secrets. If someone was to try and learn the game now, the old school way, by buying card sets and individual cards that they want from resellers, this painful process of learning would also be very expensive. You'll spend hundreds, probably thousands of dollars before you start to actually become competitive. But there are some better options now, like Dueling Nexus, Duel Links, or the Master Duel video game, which is free to play, you know how that is, but it's also a very modern game, in the sense that it's reportedly filled with bots that exploit game mechanics so that actual players can avoid the grind, which in the case of this game often takes the form of the bots stalling as much as possible to make their opponent quit. Now, players can actually take advantage of this to grind out all the little McNuggets to buy cards in-game, by mostly AFKing and doing the bare minimum to win these duels, because these bots really aren't that sophisticated. But is that fun? You know, it's quite possible that a lot of these bots actually develop this stalling strategy in order to beat other bots. But yeah, if you can look past that, or maybe it'll get resolved, I don't know. Then you only have to contend with a learning curve of the sort that comes with cottage cheese. That's just the game though, there's too many special little snowflake cards for there to be very many universal truths. But all that being said, unless you can regularly make it out to IRL events, Master Duel is likely the best way to grind experience quickly today because it was recently released, and it's hot, attracting modern players from all over and forcing you to understand the different strategies as you struggle to read and comprehend all the cards in play, and eventually get to the point where you are actually concerned with hand knowledge, meaning trying to predict what cards your opponent has in their hand. Hand knowledge is huge in Yu-Gi-Oh because a single card can and often does destroy an entire strategy, and you also have to think about what information you're revealing to your opponent as you play your hand. This is an information game. In other words, you're gonna suck for a long time because you have to read and comprehend the full text of the cards before knowing something about your opponent's hand would mean anything to you. You're also gonna be rather annoying, putting the game on hold to read the new to you cards every turn. I mean, you could just sit down trying to read card after card on your own, trying to absorb without even seeing it in action. I bet you'll read the same card 20 times before finally realizing that Pot of Greed is on the ban list anyways. That just leaves playing against a computer to learn, which is not good. Anyways, one major problem I've noticed with these cards is there is a lack of keywords. In other words, is there some effect, restriction, or immunity, etc. that is relatively common in the game? You could replace one or more convoluted sentences explaining these things with a standardized keyword, which only needs to be explained to players once. For example, there's many cards which are treated as if they were another card whenever they are on the field and subject to the effects of other cards. Instead of explaining this every time, you could just have the card it's supposed to be treated as printed on this card in some special color. Okay, that's technically not a keyword, but it's really just a matter of giving a crap about new players. You could also have some little standardized symbols. So for example, if a card has a quick effect, have a quick effect looking symbol. And then you go straight into the details of this effect, using other standardized keywords or symbols along the way. Bottom line, something has to be done to rein in all this text. I mean, it's at the point now where some of these cards have such small font that it's like the fine print on the user agreement printed by a company that has achieved an effective monopoly in their field that is now going after your soul. In fact, to the uninitiated, a lot of these cards read just like legal jargon, where it's difficult to tell precisely what every sentence means, and how exactly it relates to everything else in the document, because having their own language that just appears like ours is half the hustle. As a matter of fact, I'll take this comparison a step further. In the Yu-Gi-Oh manga, games, such as this card game, which is actually called Duel Monsters. You see, Yu-Gi-Oh actually means king of games, but no one cares because this is the only game that came out of the franchise that actually gained any steam. They threw quite a few things at the wall to see what sticks, but it turned out that the cards were the most sticky. Especially Dark Magician Girl. But I digress. In the manga, games like Duel Monsters are one of the things used by the main character Yugi's Dark Pharaoh spirit alter ego Yami as a way to judge a person's heart. This is based on the weighing of the heart trial found within ancient Egyptian beliefs, where in like the courthouse that guards the entrance to the afterlife, a person's heart is put on a scale and weighed against a feather. The recently deceased person is asked questions about their conduct during their lifetime, and they cannot lie. Unfavorable answers cause the weight of their heart on the scale to increase, and obviously it doesn't take much to outweigh a feather. The punishment for having a heart heavier than the feather at the end of questioning is to be devoured by a monster and not reach the afterlife. Funnily enough though, the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead includes spells that can cheat this trial, by having the person recite the 42 negative confessions, denying all sins, even if in some cases they are reciting a lie. I would guess this is because a recitement is not the same thing as speaking from the heart, and therefore it flies under the radar when what they say is untrue. The public school system, by the way, is something that Yugi and friends never seem to have any involvement with after the first few chapters. Anyways, so Yami Yugi has people play his shadow games as a trial of their heart, usually ending in them being punished in some ironic way related to their greatest character flaw. The game Duel Monsters is played as a shadow game many times. And there's also other situations developed where the consequences of the games are life and death. Shadow games and other games of that severity can be quickly recognized in the 4Kids anime dub by the mention of the Shadow Realm, where the loser is sent to instead of simply dying. Apparently, death is too much for kids, but a one-way ticket to a meta-dimensional realm which is designed to trap your soul is better. No brain, no pain. Now, they could have just called it Satan's Hotbox because of Yugi's hard stance on rugs.
I know marijuana is harmful. I know it can't improve my game. My friends and I have faced many battles, and we have always dueled without drugs. And losing control with drugs is one duel I don't want to...
So yeah, they play a lot of life and death games. And there's always focus put on the heart of the duelist, with their character coming out in the cards that they play. But being originally based on a trial, there's a healthy amount of meta-defining loopholes to be exploited, along with spells and trap cards and effects to keep the biggest beatstick monster cardos from having all the say. Speaking of spells, ancient Egyptians had spells for all kinds of things in their day-to-day lives. A spell would usually involve a recitement where they compared their situations to that of one of their gods, thereby borrowing some of that divine essence to overcome their challenges. For example, a sick person might try to gain the benefits of a spell referring to the baby Osiris being healed by his mother Isis, after he had been poisoned by the usurper Set. Right now, I want to take you back to the beginning. That is, the beginning of card games in Japan. So the Japanese were introduced to the standard playing cards by Portuguese merchants in the mid-16th century. It was roughly the same 52 card format that we are familiar with today, give or take a suit. And they were very sticky, and Japanese cards continued to look very similar to Western playing cards until 1633, when the Tokugawa shogunate banned such cards as a part of their isolationist policy to limit foreign influence on Japan. And Japanese card producers were forced to come up with Japanese originals. So they came up with these new styles of cards, featuring flowers, animals, yokai, and scenes like festivals and parades. Among the yokai cards, there were Obaka Karuta, meaning monster cards, featuring monster yokai from Japanese mythology kanji, paired with a symbol from the Japanese language. It was played as a trivia game where clues were given and players were tested on their knowledge of these creatures in order to collect the most cards and win the game. It was this, and games like it featuring monster cardos, that developed this trope in card games, later used by card games like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon. Yu-Gi-Oh! Actually also references the Hanifuna, or flower cards, with an entire Hanifuna card archetype. And speaking of Pokemon, Nintendo was founded in 1889 as a playing card company. They began with Hanifuna cards, and in 1959 they made a deal with Disney, where Nintendo would produce cards featuring their characters, mostly taken from European fairy tales. Kinda like The Witcher, except everything has soft edges. In the 90s, Nintendo finally got down to creating a trading card game that featured creatures mostly pulled from Japanese lore, fighting each other for the glorification of their human trainers. It was actually the video games that came first, but it quickly became this juggernaut franchise that included the card game. The Pokemon, short for Pocket Monsters anime, even had a huge impact in the form of popularizing anime in the West. I mean, it's not an anime watcher's anime, granted, but it made the art form relevant again in a time when Japan had burst its bubble and people felt like its golden years were behind it. Not gonna lie, I think Season 1 hit some high notes though, before it got super duper formulaic. Now Yu-Gi-Oh!, managed by Konami, is not just Pokemon but different. For one thing, it's based on Egyptian lore more so than Japanese. And unlike those post-apocalyptic living tumors who mutate into new forms based on fighting experience, getting rubbed down with special rocks, etc., Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters have their own gimmicks, where essentially weaker monsters have to be sacrificed in order to summon stronger ones. I mean, there's a bunch of different summoning mechanics and they keep coming up with new ones, but that's generally what it boils down to: sacrifice. Which I think is very fitting, because one of humanity's most timeless rituals, especially in ancient times, is sacrifice. The ancients knew and acted out the fact that nothing is truly free in this life, and it's always a tight game, whether you realize it or not. And mastery over the art of conscious sacrifice may even be considered the most quintessentially human skill. By the way, did you ever notice that Yugimoto's hair from the anime and manga looks like a misshapen 5-pointed star? And did you notice that Yu-Gi-Oh's equivalent to Pokemon's bug catcher is a character named Weevil? The male Weevil's method for fertilizing a female is known as traumatic insemination. They create a wound in their abdomen and inject straight into it, causing serious injury. And females of many such species are known to strongly fight against being mated in this way by any male. Weevil is also the necessary evil that keeps Yugi from developing into a full-tilt Exodia player.
Say goodbye to Exodia!
Like just a deck full of cards with draw effects and the 5 pieces of Exodia. The common allegory for going up against an Exodia player is that it's like watching someone play solitaire. Basically, assembling the 5 pieces of Exodia as a win condition is a neat concept, but it becomes really lame quickly when fully optimized for. But back to the history. So the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game began with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga by Kazuki Takahashi. Takahashi had had no major successes as a manga writer before Yu-Gi-Oh! He had wanted to create a battle manga, but struggled to come up with something original in such a saturated genre. So what he did was make use of his interest in games, everything from mahjong to tabletop RPGs, and create manga where life and death battles were played out in the form of such games. Now, this isn't a completely new concept in manga. One example of something preceding Yu-Gi-Oh! To use this concept, which immediately sticks out in my mind, are some of the less traditional fights in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, particularly the battle with Darby in Part 3. In that battle, Darby has a stand, basically a manifestation of his spirit, a similar concept to what the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga eventually provided as an explanation to what duel monsters really are. Anyways, Darby's stand has the ability to steal the soul of whoever admits defeat in their heart. So he challenges the protagonist to a series of games where they have to wager their souls to defeat him and get some information, with his specialty being to cheat at every game he plays and ensure victory. And so it becomes a game of trying to overcome the skilled cheater using their own special abilities, either catching him red-handed or finding a way to beat him despite his unfair advantages. He is eventually beaten though, through the exploitation of his inability to deal with the stress of facing an uncertainty, even though in that situation the chance that he would lose was very low. He wasn't granted a certainty, while his opponent Jotaro insisted that Darby was about to lose. And he had hinted to Darby that he had used his own stand to somehow cheat, which was also a bluff. And so Darby, unable to take the pressure, admits defeat in his heart without even playing his hand. So let's compare that to a similar fight in early Yu-Gi-Oh! Yugi versus Mokuba Kaiba 2, where they battle in a game called Capsule Monsters, which is vaguely similar to chess, with the pieces having different movement patterns. Except these pieces have levels, which grant them victory or defeat when they come in contact with enemy pieces. And they also have special abilities. Mokuba rigged this game so that Yugi would get all low-level pieces, and he get all high levels. The fact that Mokuba cheated is obvious, but pointing it out doesn't actually change anything. So Yugi just has to play the game at a huge disadvantage. He had actually beaten a cheating Mokuba once before, so this time Mokuba decided to cheat even harder, with there being a wider gap between their average piece levels. So Yugi lets his pieces get surrounded, and when Mokuba goes in for the kill, he starts activating his piece's special abilities to at least achieve mutual destruction when pieces clash. In the skirmish, he manages to have one of his pieces break away and get to the level up spot, which is like a pawn reaching the far side of the board. It gets a major power up. The battle ends with a final clash between 2 level 5 pieces, and Yugi wins, though it's not really explained why. Both of these victories focus on their opponent's flaws, based on their reliance on cheating. I mean, there is another example in JoJo's Part 3 where they go up against Darby's brother and just deceptively cheat their way to victory. But this first Darby fight is the most iconic, and for that matter the most memed, and I would venture to guess that it probably had quite an influence on Takahashi. But he did make things a little easier on himself by giving Yugioh, in other words the Pharaoh, a special ability. He has a luck stat that scales with how close he feels he is to lose it. So if he's right on the edge, about to lose, and he knows it, there's a very high chance he'll draw the perfect card for that situation. Or a luck boost in whatever other kind of game we might be talking about. This is the special ability of his Millennium Puzzle, and it's broken. You'll notice that I did point out that he has to be aware that he's about to lose for this ability to kick in though, so you see the loophole here. But it's hard to do anything that escapes his notice. So basically, even if you summon 3 blue eyes in one turn with no tributes, he'll still beat you as long as he realizes that's bad for him. For Yugioh, it's more dangerous to feel safe, and more safe to feel it's dangerous. He talks all this good stuff about the heart of the cards, but that's just a red herring. This is his real plot armor. So back to the subject of rules. When a duel happens to be a shadow game, whoever breaks the rules has to suffer a brutal punishment known as a penalty game. In this way, shadow duels function as a method to ensure that the game is played fairly while also raising the stakes. Nami still uses his ability though. I mean, luck is the most general stat in most games that feature it, so it's hard to call somebody out on it. The weird thing though is how Yugioh runs into so many people who agree to play these shadow games with him. I mean, couldn't they just beat him up? Sure, no doubt the concept of these shadow games is cool and all, but in reality, a lot of people simply believe in the adage of might is right, and will simply use threats or actual violence to win disputes and arguments. They simply want to win and thereby have their way. In fact, this adage used to be an institution in the form of trial by combat, wherein the winner of a fight can claim that God or the gods have vindicated their moral superiority by granting them victory. And then there's something I'm more familiar with in day-to-day life. Bipolar people. Where I grew up, there was a surprising density of them. In fact, I'm pretty sure that some of them were faking it, because they realized that they can get their way a lot of the time by shocking and intimidating people with strong bursts of rage that seem to come with the change of the winds. I knew this one guy when I was working at this labor job, working with dirt, pressure hoses, and front-end loaders sort of job. I think that to a certain extent, this guy was a real bipolar case. Combine that with him being used to getting his way all the time because people feared random violence from him. Like he had beaten up one of his coworkers at a previous job on a sorting line. And knowing what I know, I really doubt that guy deserved it. And the consequence was that he got this new job pretty much right away through family connections. So moving on, he was a big fan of the anime called Bleach, and he liked to scream "Ban Kai," which is like the power-up phrase for the main character. He would do things like this to shock people and vaguely talk about beating his coworkers up, so everyone just kind of kept him at arm's length and talked behind his back basically. He even started freaking out at me once because I was telling a story and I was tired, so I didn't provide enough detail for it to all make sense. Anyways, so one day we were doing some overtime hours and another coworker of ours who was on a high dose of methadone and probably something else was just kind of not doing anything of any real use. He would move around and randomly start tasks but stop before actually completing them, just spacing out and then eventually starting something else. So bipolar, we'll call him BP guy, starts getting worked up, calling him lazy, and using me as a prop in his argument, saying that I have to stay late because of his worthless butt. In reality, I wanted the overtime because usually the hours were bad and my car was in rough shape. I needed the money. I don't know about you, but I hate being used as a prop in someone else's argument. Like, I'm not your coloring book, okay? I have a blank expression because I don't want to spend the energy to care. So predictably, the situation was escalating quickly. The guy who was completely out of his mind tried to argue that he was in fact doing something useful and spoke some vague fighting words, but ultimately got out of there before it got ugly. But that wasn't the end of it. BP guy continued screaming about how he can't stand that guy and how the rest of us are too complacent about him and shouldn't be willing to pick up his slack in the future, as it will only get worse. The other guys try to explain to him that that's simply the boss's decision, but he keeps revving up. Of course, I'm thinking, yeah, if the boss wants to be negligent about this situation, I'll take the extra hours. Honestly, it really sucks having a part-time job posing as a full-time, because you need to be generally freed up from other commitments to work those random janky hours. The only advantage is you can spend a lot of time out looking for another job. So nothing my coworkers tried could bring this guy back down, and he started having a full-on tantrum, slamming this heavy metal tool known as a tamper onto the ground to emphasize each syllable. Being a bit desensitized to these scenes, I actually mostly had my head down and was working at the time, keeping an eye out and some distance. But I didn't notice in time when everyone else slipped over the room and locked the door, leaving me behind with this guy. He kept roaring louder and louder, till the echoes started sounding like amplifier static. And then, he pulled out his phone and called his mom to come pick him up. Seeing as he had previously admitted that it feels very good to be completely raging out and violent to someone, and I was the only one there, I'm lucky that he didn't just drop all reason and bash my brains in. The very last words I might have heard in my life could have been "Ban Kai." But for real though, the problem with this ruthless intimidation and violence strategy is that the people around you will stop wanting to show you any sort of support. And in our ancestral past, that would have very likely been the end of you. I'm not gonna lie to you and say that there aren't perks though. For example, as I mentioned back in the Inuyasha videos, this type of man can be popular with women because they are useful for scaring off other men, especially in unstable, dangerous environments where the unspoken social contract in general has become flimsy. This guy had openly bragged about stealing the girlfriend from one of his friends in the past. And while working at this job, he had quickly started dating this girl who had never been with a man before. in the front, technicalities, right? The point is, using violence and intimidation to get your way, even if it's somewhat subliminal, like our awareness of his disorder, is, to a certain but definite extent, a viable strategy that women pick up on. But I guess, if we bring it back, these shadow games offer a way to demonstrate supremacy in a way that isn't just tied to violence. I mean, there is more to life, and these thugs and assorted bad guys are probably tempted by their pride to show that there is also more to them, only to expose the major flaws in their character, typically that there really isn't much. In general, the idea of fighting with puzzles, riddles, and games appeals to me on some level because there is some realness there. Life is full of difficult riddles, and I'm sick of it. So back to the actual card game. This game is hard to get into, man. The so-called starter decks just aren't enough to penetrate the modern game formats. You will not even get a foothold at all. It's not like the early days when it was really all about just getting the biggest number onto the field of battle. The bigger the better in terms of numbers, and also when it comes to deck size. Not necessarily because it makes your deck stronger, but it's the rule of cool. Eventually though, Konami went and killed oversized decks, limiting them to just 60 cards. They claimed it was because larger decks were extremely time-consuming to do things like shuffling and using cards with search effects, and that there wasn't any advantage to having a massive deck when you want to quickly employ your favorite card combinations and strategies. But we all know that the real reason is that these giant decks were intimidating the female fan base. In those early days, spell and trap cards, which are cards that have different effects on the game. In the case of trap cards, they can be sprung on your opponent, even in the middle of their turn. These cards didn't yet play a huge role in the game, and the monsters themselves often didn't have effects of their own. They just smashed with their big numbers and flavor text. The fact that Dark Magician is the ultimate magician in terms of attack and defense is no longer a fact. Nor is it even that relevant in today's meta. But back then, it really meant something. And by the way, speaking of flavor text, one aspect of the anime that I feel could really have spiced up these monster cards is that they actually gave names to the monsters' attacks. Like maybe even leave a blank space so that players can name their monsters' attacks themselves. For example, what would you name the attacks of Grinder Golem? You see how this could be fun?
Now, explode a wicked dragon. Hit them with Apollo 66.
Let's go jump Kiriboo. Use your Spavash.
One notable exception to these early cards being essentially numbers with pictures is Kuribo. The original Kuribo, which translates to chestnut person, came out very early on in the development of the game, and effectively functioned as a hand trap card. Kuribo has the discard effect of keeping your opponent from hurting you with their big numbers for one turn. A hand trap, by the way, is an unofficial term for cards that work similar to trap cards, typically being activated in response to an opponent's card effect or attack. But with hand traps, you can activate them straight from your hand. The fact that you don't have to lay them down before using them makes it much harder for your opponent to take them out of the picture before it's too late. Now, if we're going to talk about monster cards, we gotta talk about dragons for at least a minute here, because it's a fun thing to talk about while I introduce some essential game concepts to those unfamiliar. And also because there are a lot of dragons in this Egyptian-themed card game. Even 2 of the 3 main Egyptian god cards are dragons, and they suck. They're just a little too hard to get onto the field for what they do. Like many things, there's exceptions to the rule, but they're mostly only good for a player who is already in a dominant position to flex. The iconic card of Yugioh, the Blue Eyes White Dragon, represents power, and the Red Eyes Black Dragon represents potential. For a while in the early meta, the Blue Eyes was the card with the biggest numbers, so it was a dual winner, so long as the opponent doesn't use some card effect to get it off the board. Only trouble was, unlike in the early manga when Kaiba could just summon 3 Blue Eyes with a side of fries with no sacrifices. Blue Eyes is a level 8 monster cardo, meaning that you have to sacrifice 2 monster cards that you have already laid down to summon it. And since you're only allowed to put down, or normal summon, 1 monster card per turn, and if you put down weak monsters without protecting them with effects, they're likely to get destroyed before you can even sacrifice them. You might lose the duel before you even get your dragon out. It's the same thing with Red Eyes Black Dragon, except Red Eyes has smaller numbers and is a level 7. To clarify, level 5s and 6s require 1 sacrifice, and anything higher requires 2. So it's not any easier to summon a Red Eyes, and you get less bang for your buck, so why bother? Well, Blue Eyes and Red Eyes are more than just standalone monster cards. They are entire card archetypes, which includes support cards and other monster cards, which typically have some kind of mutually supportive relationship with other cards of the same archetype. A support network, if you will. By the way, I'm talking about the modern game now. Red Eyes did just suck back then. So as an example of this kind of card relationship, you could slap down a level 3 Red Eyes Baby Dragon and watch it get destroyed and sent to the graveyard. This activates Baby Red Eyes' special effect. You get to summon any level 7 or below Red Eyes monster from your deck to the field, and equip Baby Red Eyes to it, which grants it 300 extra attack points. Don't talk to me or my son ever again. Okay, that's still not good enough to match even a basic Blue Eyes though, so how about this? You can use a Red Eyes fusion card to sacrifice, from your deck, 1 level 7 Red Eyes Dragon card and a level 7 Dark Magician card in order to fusion summon Red Eyes Dark Dragoon from your extra deck, which is just an extra deck you keep on the side for these sort of special summon monster cards. And special summons are summons based on certain game mechanics / walls of text. Suffice to say that the modern meta is very focused on special summoning. So this Red Eyes Dark Dragoon has the same base stats as the regular Blue Eyes, but also has immunities to many card effects, and powers up by leaps and bounds every time you use one of its special effects, which is to negate the effects of one of your opponent's cards which they just activated at the cost of discarding one card from your hand. And every time you do this, Dark Dragoon gains 1000 attack. Like, that's a really good deal, and if your opponent can't find a way to quickly get your Dragoon off the field, it's GG. This effect is limited only by the amount of cards in your hand that you have to discard. The crazy thing is, all you need to draw is a Red Eyes Fusion, and to have the prerequisite cards in your deck. You don't even need to draw those. But again, that's a modern card. They didn't even have extra decks back in the day. But they did have one kind of special summon called Fusion Summons, where you use fusion cards, such as Red Eyes Fusion, but there's many others, including general ones like Polymerization, to sacrifice 2 or more monsters of certain specifications to get something better. For instance, you could use a Polymerization card to sacrifice 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons to summon a Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, and then, to go even further beyond, use another Polymerization to sacrifice your Ultimate Dragon and a Lackluster Soldier card to fusion summon Dragon Master Knight, which actually still kind of sucks overall compared to Dragoon, but does have bigger numbers than a fresh Dragoon that hasn't started powering up using its special effect yet. Again, power versus potential. Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon is pretty good too, but it requires you to drop 2 particular cards, and it doesn't have the runaway train effect that Dragoon does. This has been only a brief look at just 2 archetypes. If you want to build an effective deck, you really need to take into consideration all the different cards out there, which isn't getting any easier as time progresses. Both of these archetypes, especially Blue Eyes, lend well towards the beatdown strategy of play, which is pretty simple and exactly what it sounds like, and is what most of the early meta consisted of. By meta, I essentially mean what works at the highest level of play. In those early days, when, again, there wasn't many monsters with effects, certainly not decent ones, good beat stick monsters would get you far. Beat stick is another unofficial term which basically means a monster that is useful due to its high attack, relative to its difficulty in getting it on the field. So a level 4 monster, which requires no sacrifices, you can just slap it down. A level 4 with attack points close to a regular level 5 or 6 could be considered a very good beat stick. Lejin, the mystical genie of the lamp, was the highest attack having level 4 monster for quite some time, making it a very good beat stick for the meta of its day. It was hard to bring the genie down when he could be summoned and start dominating the board with his 1800 attack so quickly. And by the way, defense points don't matter unless the card is in sideways defense position, where the monster can't attack, but it can take a mighty hit without the actual player taking any damage to their life points. Typically, it's only when one of your monster cards is attacked while in attack position that you take damage. By the way, the typical win condition is to reduce your opponent's life points to 0. One cool thing about defense position though is that if you lay down a card in defense, it will be face down, so your opponent will be left staring into your monster's brown eye without knowing exactly what they are dealing with. And since even weak defense position monsters insulate your life points from at least one good hit, they might go to the graveyard but they insulate, you can do this as a stalling tactic until hopefully you start drawing some cards to get your deck working. You know, it's like a lawnmower. Sometimes it takes a couple good draws before the engine gets started. And sometimes it's like a lawnmower you got from Wish.com. The efficiency of drawing useful cards goes back to good deck building, and I think that's enough theory for today. All you need now is a time machine, and you might actually win a few matches in 2002 with what I've gone over so far. Taking a Red Eyes Fusion and a Red Eyes Dark Dragoon with you wouldn't hurt too much either. In the modern era though, no. If you see Totally Awesome, that's a run on site. The thing about modern Yu-Gi-Oh is that all the fundamentals aren't so fundamental anymore. There's constant exceptions. Boss monster isn't a boss monster anymore unless it has a ton of negates built into its wall of text. In other words, exceptions, where it isn't subject to certain card effects. If it doesn't have those, it's not the boss, because it won't survive. It's just the chief executive orifice. I'll get more into the major shifts in the way that the game is played in the next video though. It'll be fun. And now that you know the very basics, if you didn't before, let's talk about cheating, which does definitely impact the tournament scene.
You're a disgrace to the game!
For example, Rory St. Clair was a legitimately skilled player in terms of deck building and making great plays, but he also took that extra step and has spent over 6 years in total banned from tournaments. At one point, when he thought that he wasn't going to return to the game, he went and said that all pro players cheat anyways. Sure, that was probably said out of frustration or what have you, but there's probably something to it. The 2017 world champion, for instance, was caught a year later blatantly cheating on camera. He didn't offer up his deck for his opponent to cut, which is a mandatory precaution against shenanigans. And what's worse, he was caught actually manipulating his deck to exert control over his draws. And what's worse than that, he knew he was on camera the whole time. Either he was doing that out of sheer habit and momentum, perhaps reinforced by the tournament culture that he knew, or
I do not use. As for a video, I cannot comment on a video that I have never seen or does not exist.
You're a disgrace to the game!
Now, to guard against the most common form of cheating in real life games, which actually tends to be in a bit of a gray area, you have to understand the little intricacies when it comes to shuffling. Of course, ideally, you want both players' decks to be highly randomized, but if, for example, your opponent does a very basic shuffling maneuver, certain cards can remain strategically clumped together, and if you do a similarly basic maneuver when cutting their deck, they'll generally stay that way. More advanced shuffling, like, well, I call it the slap chop, will help with randomization. Now, of course, your opponent will also have the chance to cut your deck, so it's important to give them nothing to work with, including keeping your card sleeves in pristine condition. If they notice some type of wear and tear on a particular card, they can use that to keep track of it, and it'll magically end up somewhere in your deck that you don't want it. Now, I'd like to talk about one more type of cheating that I've come across, way back in elementary school. A lot of kids I knew in school did this back in the day, usually at Walmart. So they would go up to one of these boxes of booster packs, which are open on top. They would subtly take out a pack and hide it underneath the box right on the edge of the shelf. That way, it's out of view of the employees, and then they would bump into it, knocking the pack to the floor. All this set up so that they can play it off as an accident if an employee does see. But if no one sees, they proceed to put their foot on top of the pack, hiding it again. And when the timing seemed right, they would kick it deep into the toy section, where a friend would be waiting to kick it further into some place where it could be securely pocketed. This was back in grade 6, and it taught me to never trust little kids.
You're a disgrace to the money.
Let's talk business before I trail off again. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game was launched in America in 2002 by Konami, with Upper Deck Entertainment being licensed to actually produce the card. Konami, which had been in charge of the English dub of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime via their recently acquired subsidiary 4Kids Media. Although they changed the name recently, it's called whatever, everybody knows it as 4Kids. 4Kids is kind of legendary in the world of anime dubbing. See, they take these anime that are really teen-oriented, like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or One Piece, and then they try to make them for kids, with often confusing, awkward, and just hilarious consequences, especially when they can't keep the tone consistent. They also felt the need to Americanize things, so rice balls became donuts and hamburgers, and most of the main crew in Yu-Gi-Oh! Were given American-sounding names. In the case of supporting character Joey Wheeler, they also gave him a Brooklyn accent. Joey was actually a really one-dimensional character, at least in terms of dueling ability. He had a drunk and a presumably abusive dad, a plot point which was explored for a grand total of like 2 panels in the manga. In the anime, they never even bothered with this plot point. Remember what I said about Yu-Gi-Oh! Being a franchise that throws things at the wall to see what sticks? Now here's a Monster of the Week story from the early manga that stuck in the sense that it predicted the future. It involves Joey putting his life on the line to obtain a highly coveted pair of sneakers called Air Muscles, but then he and the gang end up getting jumped over this pair of sneakers. I can draw obvious parallels with what happens with similarly named sneakers in more recent times. It's a real Black Friday situation which often makes the news, and Takahashi all but predicted it in the late 90s. Actually, Yu-Gi-Oh! In its heyday could get a little rowdy at times too, such as a riot that occurred at the Tokyo Dome, where Konami was hosting a tournament where all attendees could purchase a special pack of cards, called Premium Pack 1, which Konami claimed would not be available later or elsewhere. Naturally, they ran out of space, and people started getting turned away at the door. They knew they didn't have enough Premium Pack 1s for the 65,000 strong crowd either, so they decided to delay the selling of these packs while trying to gain control of the crowd, which went about as well as you might expect. Then they decided to cancel the sale outright, and the riot police were called in. This all happened back in '99, before Westerners even had the game. If anything, I think this shows just how quickly this game rose in popularity, and also how Konami, even in their home country, is disconnected enough to not really know what they're doing. They know about making money when they've got something hot though. They're known to try and maintain control over access to the meta, in other words, the cards for building top-ranked tournament decks, through booster packs and special promotional packs, which typically eventually go out of print. Couple that with the ever-changing banned and limited list for cards in tournaments, which constantly changes up the meta so they can sell new cards and make life a little harder for card resellers. So anyways, first came Takahashi's manga, beginning in 1996. Then the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime series, known as Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, animated by the super not petty about copyright Toei Animation, began in 2000, with the English dub being produced by 4Kids starting in 2001. The actual card game, though, preceded the anime in Japan, and came out in 2002 in the West. So basically, we can infer that the anime and the trading card game were both part of the plan from the start, with the Western strategy being more of a 1-2 punch, leading with the anime to build hype, and then start selling the card game. After all, barely anyone in the West would have been aware of this manga. This strategy worked. It worked really well. Yu-Gi-Oh! Became legitimately cool, and all over the schoolyard people had their cards. They might have mostly played by their own rules, because the rules Konami first posted in the Legend of Blue Eyes starter decks were already asking a lot out of people who just wanted to have some fun. But the cards looked cool, and they served fine as collectibles anyways. It was only a few months after the first release of the card game in North America that the meta scene began to take shape there, meaning there were people who took the rules seriously, because they took winning seriously. And to win, you have to eke out every advantage you can get, which requires a deep understanding of the rules, knowing which you can bend or even covertly break, and what rules you can throw in your opponent's face. And this is a game with a lot of moving parts, which creates a lot of odd situations, where the way to proceed in the game is not always obvious, and sometimes impossible. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game was the third big one to come out, after Magic and Pokemon. And unlike those games, Duel Monsters doesn't have a simple, dedicated resource system like mana or energy cards. Instead, you sacrifice your monster cardos, banish cards from your deck, and just all kinds of different ways to pay the troll toll and overpower your opponent. Pretty much every card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is also considered a resource under some circumstance. And can you just imagine how hard that is for Konami to balance? The point is, it's set up in such a way that it just becomes more and more complicated. But this does appeal to a certain type of person. The type of person to spend hundreds of dollars on cards, countless hours on mastering each new meta, and a toxic attitude towards new players, crushing and demoralizing them as much as possible, so that they can feel on top for as long as possible. We can just call this the Kaiba archetype. The character, Seto Kaiba, is an interesting cat. He's based on an actual toxic player that Kazuki Takahashi was told about by a friend. This player told his friend, who had expressed interest in getting better at a game, that he should come back and talk to him only after he had collected 10,000 cards. Kaiba is this child billionaire who will do anything to win at Duel Monsters, including tracking people down and driving them to offing themselves, just so he can get his hands on their Blue Eyes White Dragon card, which again represents power. Winning is everything to Seto Kaiba, whose family name means sea lion. You see, sea lions, just like their extra thick cousins the walruses, compete fiercely for control over large harems of females. Like landlions basically, and in their case, the spoils usually just end up going to the largest males. And also possibly the males with the holographic Blue Eyes White Dragon. Seto Kaiba is the ultimate toxic player. Notice how he starts wearing a trench coat after being beaten by Yugi so many times. Actually, let's just take that in another direction real quick. To me, Kaiba's coat actually looks like what Japanese motorcycle gangs might wear. You see, they wear flashy clothes like this because they want to advertise themselves, as many have aspirations to be recruited into the larger, more organized Yakuza organizations, who, in turn, invest their proceeds from this and that into many different corporations across Japan and abroad. So depending on how they play their cards, a person might go from being a street punk without much hope for the future, to being a major shareholder in a large corporation. You know, they say that the machine that's created when people try to put together a system of corporate management can ultimately cause the mistreatment of employees and sour a company's reputation. Seto Kaiba, though, rides the machine, and he owns this poor treatment of employees. You see, Kaiba Corp, to me, seems to reference this hypothetical story arc. This company was originally a weapons manufacturer with an unclear customer base, but when Seto took over, he changed this to have it focus on games. And let's just take a look into how Seto took over the company in the first place. First of all, as an orphan, he got himself and his little brother Mokuba adopted by Mr. Kaiba by putting the man, who on top of owning Kaiba Corp was the world chess champion, on the spot in front of the media, challenging him to a game of chess, and saying that if he won, the man was to adopt him and his brother. Seto won this game because he is a genius, but he didn't gain a cushy, pampered childhood out of it. Mr. Kaiba put him through a brutal training regimen to prepare Seto to take over the company someday, an event which ended up coming a lot sooner than expected. See, as a test, Seto was given $1 million and tasked with multiplying it to 100 million within a day. Big mistake. Not only does Seto quickly increase his funds, but he manages a hostile takeover of Kaiba Corp right then and there, causing Mr. Gozaburo Kaiba to jump out his high-rise window. It was his final lesson to his adopted son Seto. Failure is death. Ironically, Seto Kaiba would go on to stand on the edge of a cliff so that Yugi would forfeit their second duel, because Yugi knew that if his monster attacked, Seto would be knocked off by the shockwave. Even though the monsters are holograms in this case, but whatever. It's a unique take on Gozaburo's final lesson for sure. He probably had a parachute under that coat. So Seto might be the archetypal toxic player, but he has the backstory and ability to back it up when he tells you that you're a third-rate duelist with a fourth-rate deck.
It looks like Joey might actually win.
Mokuba, if Joey wins this duel, I will gladly give you control of Kaiba Corp.
Yay! I will call it Mokusoft, and we will develop frustrating operating systems that nobody wants to develop for.
Hey, you know why Bill Gates got divorced? She got tired of his Microsoft. Real talk, I bet Kaiba sells a lot more cards than Yugi, who fights using friendship. You know, Nakama power, and whose hair is a crown, so your argument is invalid. And also, of course, his magical luck boost when he sees things are getting dangerous. Kaiba, on the other hand, stubbornly dismisses all this magic stuff, even when it's right in front of him, and only really believes in domination by any means, which is why his hair looks distinctly like a symbol of his will for domination. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is now the top-selling trading card game of all time, and it would never have happened if it was just this dumpy Pikachu at the helm. Kaiba is a big part of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Brand, especially back before the actual trading card game's fanbase started to become more of its own thing, rather than just fans of the anime. The spirit of Seto Kaiba is still very much alive though, with the amount of money that one has to sink in to break into the modern meta.
So you've got a dweeb army. Am I supposed to be scared to attack?
Well, only if destroying an innocent soul concerns you.
Nah. As the president of a major corporation, I have to do that every day.
So, before I wrap this video up, I'd like to talk a little bit about some cards I find interesting. Time Wizard is an absolute legend. He looks just like TT from Diddy Kong Racing, and he doesn't afraid of anything. His ability can turn Baby Dragon into 1,000-year dragon, and his opponent's monsters into graveyard dust. This card was a gift from Yugioh to his best friend and former bully Joey Wheeler, who absolutely sucks at duel monsters. I mean, this guy builds decks full of monsters, not realizing that it's a necessity to use spell and trap cards to troll your opponents. So his best bud Yugioh gave him this monster card with this plot convenience effect. But the thing is, at this tournament they were both participating in at the time, it was, like I just said, a tournament. So as the main and semi-main characters, Yugioh and Joey end up facing each other. Yugioh pulls out his iconic Dark Magician and Joey his Time Wizard, using his effect to try and age Dark Magoo out of existence. It was a trap though, as this 1,000-year time compression ability only caused Dark Magician to gain experience and knowledge, and become the more powerful Dark Sage. Yugioh had clearly planned this out all along, giving Joey Wheeler a card he didn't fully understand, knowing that it would backfire on Joey against Dark Magician and thereby eliminate Joey as a threat. I would say it was a dirty tactic, but it's more of a friendly courtesy that Yugioh would pretend that Joey was such a threat as to deserve all this effort. Dark Magician Girl is weaker than Dark Magician, but she gains 300 attack power for every Dark Magician or Magician of Black Chaos in your graveyard. I believe this effect is to say that she gains power as her body count rises. Now let's talk about real magic. And by the way, Dark Magician and Girl were originally Black Magician and Girl. Their names were censored in the English translation because at the time people were sensitive about occult references. Oh, how the times have changed. But yeah, just like with 4Kids anime dubs, Konami has made a lot of perplexing decisions when it comes to card releases outside of Japan. So, Black Magic is a class of magic. In other words, a class of moves, manipulations, etc. that the majority of people don't understand, which allows you to achieve an effect at the cost of someone's vitality. For example, in the movie The Matrix, machines are farming humans for the electric energy produced by their central nervous systems, while keeping their minds occupied by presenting them with this massively multiplayer living in the 90s experience. In essence, the machines understand what is going on better than the humans, and they use that to extract the vitality in the form of energy without resistance. So in reality, even though this is really just my opinion, magicians are really just people who possess knowledge and skills, which are practical, but also rather esoteric, and sometimes even purposely deceptive. And black magic is just one road a magician can go down. So in one of the flashback sequences in the anime, it is revealed that 99 lives were sacrificed in order to create the Millennium items through a process called shadow alchemy. These items were meant to protect the tombs of the pharaohs, with further sacrifices made in the form of people who tried to wield the items, but were deemed unworthy by the items themselves. So the magicians of the pharaoh, the original Dark Magician being chief among them, along with his apprentice, the original Dark Magician Girl, spent all these lives of innocent villagers to create these wards, and these items caused the deaths of many tomb raiders. This effect, by the way, is a reference to the phenomenon known as the Curse of the Pharaohs, where real-life Egyptologists seem to have dropped like flies after opening certain tombs. In reality, these correlations are pretty dubious at best. In fact, European nobles were eating mummies, and also mummy dust, because they believed that it had medical properties, that it was good for preventing blood coagulation, epilepsy, and gout. And due to a lack of study at the time, Europeans believed that mummies were around 13,000 years old, which gave them a mystical, primordial association. They also believed that Incan mummies had the same properties, and referred to this material medica as mummia. So basically, if the Curse of the Pharaohs is real, those Europeans snorting lines of mummy dust were being rather unscientific to not report on it. So in the Yu-Gi-verse, the Millennium items granted all sorts of powers, including being able to summon actual real-life duel monsters out of people's spirits, which is what the in-universe card game was later based on. So basically, I conjecture that the arts that the Dark Magician and Dark Magician Girl study are of a similar nature to the creation of the Millennium items. DMG is the type of girl who goes to a bar full of top-level scientists and flutters her eyelashes a little, fully expecting that before the night is through, she'll be provided with a handheld particle accelerator capable of destroying her enemies, in exchange for the privilege of just getting to talk to her. And just in case you weren't just dumbstruck by Kawaii Blondes, Konami actually came up with other flavored magician girls. And then there's Magi Magician Girl, who costs a little more to summon, but lets you use your opponent's monsters against them. This girl might be using her magic, but at least in her case she's not expending the resources of allies, and that's about the best you can hope for. Now, Dark Magician Girl, the Dragon Knight, is created by fusing DMG with the Dragon card. I believe this is a symbol of the rare teamwork of Yugi and Kaiba. Dark Magician and sometimes Girl are Yugi's signature cards, and Blue Eyes is Kaiba's. You know what's funny though? Yugi actually has his own living version of the Apprentice Magician in the form of the character Taya. Taya shows signs of interest in Yugi every now and then, but he never, ever makes a move. I mean, I get that he's such a dweeb that he fights the urge to bully his own reflection, but trying to get the girl, or at the very least, beating yourself up for not trying, is a biological imperative. You know what I think her character could be better used to represent is the hang-around girl from the Degradation of a Fanbase cycle. You know, where a girl goes to a mostly male club purely because she knows she'll get a lot of attention, followed by dude bros after her and girls like her, and none of them have any real interest in the game, and the situation quickly devolves from there. You know, I was once told, as tempting as it may be, it's not preferable to rent a room to a girl who's on the dating scene, because there's a danger that you may learn too much about female nature to ever love again. But yeah, Taya is like Tuna Izam Sakura, an exposition benchwarmer. You're never quite sure how they're actually going to use her, and then it's over. For real though, that phenomenon that I talked about, that is a thing that happens, but there are a lot of serious female Yu-Gi-Oh players. Although I get the sense that, compared to men, women are more on the building a collection side of things than going to tournaments, and I can see why. Male competitiveness, when kept within certain bounds of reason, is a healthy and natural thing. But there's always a few players out there who are a bit unbalanced in that department and can be downright toxic, playing mind games, gaslighting, and outright cheating just to get a W. And to put myself in their mental mindset for a second, I think that women look like good targets for this sort of, let's call it, domination tactics. The other thing, of course, is that there's always some truth in stereotypes, and female players report getting hit on at those places by guys with fairly janky social skills. I mean, it's to be expected, supply and demand and all that, but they'll do things like treat a matchup with a girl as a speed date, basically implying that she's there for that reason with the game only as a pretext. Here's the thing. Competitive Yu-Gi-Oh is hard for women to break into because they already spend a lot of their money on makeup and then they have to pay for all these cards. I mean, this girl has slashed her makeup budget to be here, and you think she's not serious. Can't you see her war face? Another reason I see girls being into collecting is because there's a lot of cute cards in the game. There's just a certain value to collecting things that resonate with you, but also connect you to a larger community. I mean, Beanie Babies were massively successful, but they weren't half as cute as, Ash Blossom. Cheap, cheap, cheap. Madolce Angeli, or Melfi Rabi. You can build a half-decent deck out of a lot of these cards too. I mean, for Konami, the move to make may be to make cute cards more relevant in the meta, thereby possibly getting a few more girls to come by tournaments and play with their favorites, and thereby possibly getting a lot more men to show up for impure reasons. But hey, they gotta buy cards too. It's like a cover charge at the nightclub. Dark Magician, by the way, has 2 Dragon Rider forms, and one of his card artworks is a total JoJo pose. But DMG is a girl. It's like Daenerys from Song of Ice and Fire, man. Now let's talk about Harpy Lady. Harpy Lady is the signature card of My Valentine, and her theme is... Harpy Lady is in uniform, and even Harpy's pet dragon is wearing a BDSM style collar. So what is a harpy exactly? Like many such beasts, yokai, or cryptids, whatever term you prefer, harpies actually point towards something slightly more general about the human experience. And how do I put this? It's scientifically proven that women tend to be more neurotic than men. That is, more sensitive to negative emotion. And sometimes, not that this is just women, but the cliche female form if you would, sometimes neurotic sensitivity can create such a strong positive feedback loop that it becomes like this upward spiral, a disorienting storm for anyone, usually a man, who gets caught in it. Funnily enough though, the Harpies were said to serve Zeus directly as a means of punishment. Under his command, they steal food off your plate and keep you hungry, and sometimes even befoul the leftovers. Now, I'm not quite sure what that's meant to symbolize, but I guess the Thunderbolts just aren't quite surgical enough for all of Zeus's punishments. Sometimes you're gonna make a psychological power move and show them that even female chaos itself will do your bidding. My Valentine's Harpies are done a little different though. Their connection with Zeus is that it feels good to dominate. With spikes. And by the way, you may have noticed that Yugi, especially Yami Yugi, is in full BDSM gear. Honestly, I kinda feel like I picked up on their thought process for doing this. I think they were trying to make kids and younger teens look up to the character because he appears to be into grown-up stuff that they don't need to understand. It's also indicative of a man who's willing to sacrifice life points for final victory. Lastly, but not least, let's take a look at Obelisk the Tormentor. Obelisk the Tormentor is arguably the most useful of the 3 Egyptian god cards in the actual TCG, trading card game, which is like saying that chickens are the most skilled at detecting landmines among farm animals. There's simply many better options out there. As I explained before, god cards are quite strong, but they're just a little too hard to get onto the field to be very viable. But of course, if Konami wished it, they could change this very quickly by introducing a new, easier summoning mechanic for god cards. It just wouldn't be as profitable as producing dozens of new god-adjacent cards. In the anime though, Obelisk is the Egyptian god card wielded by Kaiba in the Battle City arc, and it is so strong that he can defeat a no-name duelist with just that one card and a hand wave. Later on, Obelisk starts having his effects explained, and he just keeps getting more ridiculous. First, he can sacrifice 2 monsters to seriously increase his attack. Then he was able to destroy all monsters on the field, and then destroy all monsters plus 4,000 damage. And then it turns out there's an effect which increases Obelisk's attack points to infinity. An obelisk is a stone pillar of roughly the shape you see on screen. Ancient Egyptian obelisks in particular were special though. They were always made out of a single piece of stone, chiseled typically out of red granite. and transported to the Nile using impressive technologies, before being floated on a boat to near its final erection site where all the finishing touches were applied. Like the pyramids, ancient Egyptian obelisks would have their very top sections covered in gold, or sometimes a mixture of gold and silver called electrum, which I'm sure shone brilliantly in the Egyptian sun for future tomb raiders to take note of from many miles away. These obelisks were symbolic of the sun god Ra and were often placed in pairs in front of temples, like guardian sentinels. Obelisks served to symbolize both a petrified ray of sunlight and the erect human ding-dong, as both are the bestowers of life that keep the cycle going. I think this is accurate in the sense that the fertile soil on the Nile bank, as well as the fertility of the female womb, both require that which the obelisk symbolizes to produce life, and thereby the strength of the obelisk is the strength of the dynasty and kingdom itself. You see, you gotta understand here that just like with certain dysfunctions a man could have, ancient people didn't have too many strong scientific models predicting that the sun will rise again in the morning, so the night always made them a little nervous, as they pictured the celestial hero gods battling to traverse the underworld beneath the horizon. Brings a whole new meaning to the saying, "Don't worry, in another few hours the sun will rise." Presently, the government of Egypt is in the process of constructing a kilometer-tall obelisk in their planned new capital, which is to the east of the Nile. Men of means have long competed to build the highest skyscraper, with new records set in places like New York, Dubai, and Shanghai heralding in new economic paradigms. But perhaps the humble obelisk, symbol of bringing forth life from the fertile soil, is more to the point. Lots of civilizations have taken on the erecting of obelisks, of course. In fact, the word obelisk is actually of Greek origin. The large obelisk in front of the Pope's palace in Rome is 455 tons of stone, and was originally from the temple of Amun in Kamuk, although in its history it has broken and been restored. So it's no longer truly a pharaoh-quality one-piece obelisk anymore. Pharaoh Amun must be pained at the mishandling of his obelisk. The Washington Monument is a very famous obelisk. Most of the architecture of the US Capitol is actually based on that of ancient Rome, and the Romans loved to steal obelisks from Egypt, so they became associated with the historical depiction of Rome. Obelisks have actually been shipped out of Rome to places like London and New York as recently as the 19th century. The Washington Monument has its own pyramidium, which uses reflective aluminum. Perhaps this is because if they use gold, tomb raiders would come in droves from Baltimore. But Obelisk the Tormentor, to me, is more than just a stone pillar of light that allows life to flourish. That's why I like to call him Bobelisk, because I perceive him also as an NPC archetype with my massive headcanon. Bobelisk is rank 2 in the divine hierarchy, making him powerful and untargetable by monsters beneath his rank, but still unable to touch the rank 1. This has caused a serious complex in the mind of Bobelisk, to where he feels like he needs to take out his feeling of inferiority on those in a worse position than him. He torments by providing mortals with a glimmer of hope for a better life that they can cling to, only to make them jump through hoops and struggle needlessly and get gaslighted all the while, as Bobelisk extracts some of his life's little pleasures from their torment, thereby venting some of his feelings of futility over not being the most high among gods. Once every 1,000 years, Bobelisk shows the most faint of hints, the slightest glimmer of remorse and guilt for his vindictive and downright immature deeds. He might even take pity on his subjects, offering them free use of some of his resources to improve their station. Only, unless the person he takes pity on is also highly talented, it's not nearly enough to escape his crushing control. And soon they are so demoralized that all progress made in that interim is now lost. All of it playing out like the great cosmic cycles, which is a very common motif when it comes to Egyptian deities. Alright folks, I'm gonna end things here. Next time, we're gonna actually learn how to play the game for real, as well as cover more of the history and lore. Fun stuff.
I want you to hit me as hard as you can. Mirror force!